The moment Marcus wheeled his sleek, black $400,000 sports car out of his garage that crisp Friday morning, a strange sense of unease slithered down his spine, one he couldn't quite shake despite the sun glinting off the car's polished curves and the neighborhood's usual hum of mundane weekend chatter. As he shifted the car into drive, he noticed a group of teenagers loitering by the corner, whispering and nudging each other with those unmistakable looks, half mischief, half malice, and before he could even fully process their intentions, one of them, a burly kid with a baseball cap pulled low, stepped directly into his path, waving him to stop, laughter bubbling in a way that sent a shiver down his spine, as if the air around them had thickened with tension and malice. Marcus's pulse quickened as he realized they weren't just playing around. They were sizing him up, and every instinct screamed at him to drive away. But the car was his pride, a symbol of years of hard work, and the thought of leaving it vulnerable ignited a protective fury that made him grip the wheel tighter, eyes scanning for an escape route, only to see another teen discreetly moving towards the garage where the car key was hanging, a plan clearly forming in their collective mind, sinister and audacious. And then, before he could react, one of them yanked a can of gasoline from a backpack, the stench instantly hitting him, and as Marcus leapt out, shouting for them to stop, the first match struck. Flames licking the polished metal, reflecting in the horrified eyes of neighbors who had now gathered, a mix of shock and fear rippling through the street, while the teens scattered, leaving Marcus frozen, the fire climbing rapidly, his mind racing through disbelief and anger in equal measure, until a sudden voice over the phone startled him, a calm but forceful tone delivering a single chilling line. "Son, I just saw the news. Your car's on fire, and those punks are still out there." Marcus's head snapped towards the caller ID, his blood running cold when he saw it. His father's name flashing on the screen, not just any father, but the Attorney General of the state, a man whose presence alone could change the course of events in an instant, whose enemies were ruthless and whose power was absolute. And suddenly Marcus realized this wasn't just random vandalism. This was a calculated risk someone had taken, oblivious to the storm they were about to awaken. And as the fire blazed higher, Marcus's hands trembled on the scorched hood of his car, the asphalt beneath reflecting the flickering inferno, and he understood in that instant that whatever justice came next would be swift, personal, and merciless. Yet before he could even process his next move, a neighbor's terrified scream split the air, pointing across the street to a figure lurking in the shadows, not a teen, but a tall, ominous silhouette, watching Marcus with an intensity that made his skin crawl, and the realization struck him that he wasn't just dealing with petty vandals. Someone much darker, someone who had been waiting for this exact moment, was now orchestrating events in ways Marcus could barely comprehend, and before he could call his father back, the silhouette vanished into the alley with inhuman speed, leaving only a lingering sense of dread and the roaring fire that threatened to consume not only his prized possession but perhaps the calm he thought he had left in his life. And as he dialed 911, hands shaking, fire crackling around him, he caught sight of a discarded matchbook at the edge of the curb, the logo faint but familiar, linking the fire to a name he hadn't heard in years, a name that once meant nothing but now seemed to whisper a prophecy of revenge, betrayal, and danger so immediate that the thought alone made him gasp for air. The flames mirrored in his eyes, and in that harrowing moment, he understood this wasn't just about a car. It was a message, a challenge, and a declaration, and by the time the fire department arrived, Marcus already knew that the story of his life, the secrets of his father's office, and the thin veneer of safety he had always taken for granted had just been ripped away in a single, terrifying blaze, leaving him teetering on the edge of a confrontation that would consume everything he had ever known. And yet as he stood there, the heat on his face, the smoke stinging his lungs, a subtle noise caught his attention, a soft crunch of gravel behind him, and as Marcus turned slowly, heart hammering, he glimpsed a shadowy figure crouched low, camera in hand, capturing every detail, every reaction, every flicker of panic, and with a slow, deliberate step forward, the figure whispered, almost to themselves, "Perfect! Now they'll know what happens when you cross the wrong sun." And Marcus realized with a jolt that this fire, this humiliation, was only the beginning, and what came next would test not only his courage, but the very legacy of his father, the Attorney General, whose name alone carried the weight of consequences that no one could escape. And just as the fire truck sirens pierced the neighborhood, Marcus felt the unmistakable prickle of being hunted, and knew that nothing in his life would ever be ordinary again. Marcus barely had time to catch his breath before the fire crews descended, hoses spraying and water hissing as it met the blazing inferno of his car. But even amidst the chaos, his mind raced faster than the frantic movements around him, because the shadowy figure with the camera was nowhere to be seen, and yet Marcus felt their presence, like a predator circling invisibly, calculating each step, measuring his fear, and the thought sent a cold shiver down his spine, compelling him to dial his father again, only to hear a measured, calm voice that both reassured and terrified him. "Marcus, stay where you are, don't touch anything, don't speak to anyone outside of me." And as he nodded, almost to himself, he realized that this wasn't just an ordinary threat. It was deeply personal, a deliberate strike meant to provoke, to humiliate, and to test the limits of the Attorney General's influence. And as he spoke with his father, Marcus caught sight of a police cruiser slowly pulling up at the end of the street, lights flashing in a staccato rhythm, but even the arrival of law enforcement couldn't erase the feeling that something more sinister was unfolding just beyond the perimeter, as if the night itself had grown darker, heavier, and suddenly, from the corner of his eye, he noticed a glint, subtle but unmistakable, reflecting the firelight from an alleyway across the street, a flash that hinted at movement, deliberate and calculated, and as he squinted, Marcus saw a silhouette that was both familiar and chilling, the kind of presence that haunted dreams and made rational thought impossible, and without warning, the figure raised a hand, and Marcus's stomach dropped as he realized they were signaling someone else, a silent call to action that only made sense to those in the know, and in that instant, Marcus understood that this attack had been meticulously planned, that every detail from the selection of his car, the timing of the fire, to the shadows lurking nearby, had been orchestrated to provoke a response, and the knowledge that his father's enemies had eyes on him made the hairs on the back of his neck stand, the sweat on his palms clammy, and his heart pounding like a drum in a war march, and before he could react further, the fire department commander approached him, a mixture of concern and urgency in his eyes, and said, "Sir, we've contained the blaze, but there's something else. You need to see this," and he gestured toward a nearby security camera feed on his tablet, showing the flames engulfing the car, and in the corner, just barely noticeable, a figure slipping away, moving with unnerving stealth, disappearing into the shadows, yet leaving behind a single ominous clue, a piece of paper fluttering on the sidewalk, charred at the edges but legible enough to send Marcus's pulse into overdrive, scrawled with a name and a date, referencing someone from his father's past, someone Marcus knew only through whispered stories, a person rumored to have vanished under mysterious circumstances years ago, and suddenly Marcus realized that what had begun as a petty act of vandalism was connected to a network of vengeance, grudges, and secrets that stretched far beyond the sleepy suburban street, and as he bent down to pick up the paper, his phone vibrated violently, a text from an unknown number flashing ominously. "Stop looking, or the next one won't be a car," and the message, though brief, carried the weight of pure menace, sending a jolt of fear and adrenaline through him, yet he couldn't ignore it, couldn't back down, because he now knew that the attack wasn't just about destruction. It was a statement, a challenge, and perhaps a trap designed to provoke the Attorney General, his father, into making a move that someone could exploit, and as he stared at the charred note, a sudden commotion behind him made him spin around, only to see a group of neighbors clustering at the edge of the scene, whispering, pointing. Some frightened, some curious, but none noticing the small, almost imperceptible footprints in the wet asphalt that led away from the fire, markings so deliberate and precise they could only belong to someone trained, someone who wanted Marcus to follow, or perhaps to think they had, and without realizing it, his instincts pushed him to trace the path, step by careful step, and with each footfall, he felt the weight of being hunted, the invisible eyes pressing down, until the trail led him to a dimly lit side street, the faint smell of smoke lingering in the air, and there, lying discarded on the curb, was a small, black envelope with no return address, sealed with wax and stamped with an emblem Marcus recognized instantly, the emblem of a secretive law firm rumored to handle the most dangerous clients, people with power, money, and vendettas that could topple careers or lives with ease, and trembling, he broke the seal, unfolding the paper inside, revealing a message so precise, so cutting, that Marcus's stomach churned. It contained a map of the neighborhood with several homes marked, including his father's residence, and beside each home was a series of numbers, cryptic at first, but unmistakably a countdown, a timeline, and the last mark, glaring in red ink, was Marcus's own address, with the ominous note, "Act carefully. You're next," and before he could digest the gravity of the message, a sudden sound, a soft click behind him, like the shutter of a camera, made him spin around, only to find the street empty, shadows stretching unnaturally long under the flickering streetlights, and as he strained to see, he realized the figure from before had returned, perched high on a fire escape, observing, recording, and a malicious smirk visible even in the dim light, and the realization hit Marcus like a lightning bolt. This wasn't random, this wasn't petty teenage vandalism, this was an orchestrated psychological assault, a test of courage and reaction, and a message that his life, his father's career, and everyone close to him could be at risk if they didn't play the game exactly right. And as the night deepened, the air thick with smoke and tension, Marcus understood the horrifying truth. Someone had chosen him deliberately. Someone who knew exactly who he was, his vulnerabilities, his routines, and that. Fire was only the opening act, and before he could take another step, his phone rang, an unknown number flashing ominously, and when he answered, a distorted voice whispered with chilling clarity, "Do you see now why your father never sleeps?" And the line went dead, leaving only Marcus, the charred remains of his car behind him, and a night that promised terror far beyond anything he could have imagined. Marcus froze, every muscle coiled like a spring, as the circle of shadowed figures, the drone hovering overhead, and the ominous SUV now flanking him, closed in with an almost ritualistic precision, the night air thick with tension, the smell of charred asphalt still lingering from his car, and though fear clawed at his chest, a spark of determination ignited within him, a hard-earned instinct from years of living in the shadow of his father's power and the relentless awareness of danger that had shaped him into someone who couldn't simply be scared into submission. And as he scanned the faces of the figures approaching, his mind raced through every piece of knowledge he had about them, every rumor, every past encounter, trying to find leverage, a weakness, any hint of humanity to exploit. But what confronted him was a wall of cold calculation, smiles devoid of warmth, eyes filled with the promise of pain and chaos. And then, with a sudden, almost imperceptible motion, the lead figure, the one from his father's past, long thought gone, whose very name sent shivers down Marcus's spine, stepped forward and raised a hand, signaling the others to halt, a tense silence falling that seemed to suspend time itself, and Marcus felt the air pulse with anticipation, knowing that whatever happened next would define the trajectory not only of his own life but of his father's career, their family's safety, and the network of power that the Attorney General had spent decades building. And before he could speak, the figure's voice cut through the stillness, cold, commanding, and deliberate. "You've been marked, Marcus, but you are clever. Let's see if you have what it takes to survive the night." And at that moment, a movement behind the figure caught Marcus's eye, a flash of metal, the unmistakable glint of a blade, but before panic could fully take over, Marcus remembered a lesson from his father about observation, timing, and the element of surprise, and with a quick pivot, he grabbed a nearby discarded fire extinguisher, swinging it with force toward the figure, creating a momentary distraction that caused the circle of attackers to stagger, and in that split second, Marcus sprinted toward the SUV, throwing himself inside just as the doors swung open, slamming the locks with a resounding click, and adrenaline surged through him as he fumbled for the keys still clenched in his pocket, heart hammering like a war drum, realizing that survival now depended on precision, speed, and an almost impossible calm under absolute chaos. And as he fired up the engine, the SUV's lights cutting through the darkness, the drone whirring menacingly above, he noticed movement in the rearview mirror, a masked figure darting across the street, eyes locked on him, hands raised in silent threat, and Marcus knew that the night was far from over. That escaping physical harm was only the first layer of a challenge that had been carefully constructed to test him mentally, emotionally, and morally, and as he maneuvered through the narrow streets, weaving past obstacles and unaware civilians, he realized that each street, each alley, each turn seemed to have been anticipated by the attackers, as if the city itself had been mapped for his pursuit, and the envelope with its map and red-inked countdown still burned metaphorically in his mind, reminding him that every step mattered, that every decision was a gamble with life and legacy hanging in the balance. And then, as he reached a main road, headlights flashing in the distance signaled approaching danger, and Marcus instinctively swerved into a side street, narrowly avoiding what would have been a deadly collision, only to find himself confronted with a second vehicle blocking his path, a black van with tinted windows, engine idling ominously, and a single figure stepping out, removing their hood to reveal a face he knew too well, an estranged former associate of his father, someone whose cunning and ruthlessness had been whispered about in legal circles, someone who had disappeared years ago under suspicious circumstances, and now stood there, exuding an aura of control and menace that made Marcus's blood run cold, and as the figure spoke, voice dripping with malice, they revealed the ultimate truth, that the fire, the surveillance, the envelopes, the drones, even the stalkers, none of it had been random. It was a meticulously orchestrated campaign to test Marcus, to probe the vulnerabilities of the Attorney General himself, to send a message to anyone who dared challenge their influence, and Marcus realized with a jolt that he was not merely a victim. He was a pawn in a much larger game of power, revenge, and legacy, and before he could react, the van door opened, revealing more figures, trained, silent, moving in perfect synchronization, and at that moment, Marcus's mind worked at lightning speed, recalling his father's advice about leverage and intimidation, the networks of allies, and the precise knowledge that power is as much about perception as reality, and seizing the opportunity, he slammed the SUV into reverse, creating a cloud of dust and debris, narrowly avoiding the nearest attackers, and in the chaos, managed to activate a hidden panic alarm on his phone, immediately alerting his father and a trusted team of security operatives who had been monitoring the situation in real time, and within minutes, the night erupted into a controlled frenzy of flashing lights, authoritative commands, and the unmistakable presence of law enforcement and private security surrounding the attackers, cutting off escape routes, and turning what had been an almost cinematic trap into a controlled standoff. And as Marcus stepped out of the SUV, adrenaline still coursing through him, eyes scanning every shadow, he saw the lead figure, the one thought lost to history, being restrained, the drones deactivated, the envelopes and maps collected as evidence, and for the first time that night, a sliver of relief pierced the tension, though he knew the war of threats, power, and influence was far from over, and as his father arrived on the scene, exuding the calm authority of someone who had weathered storms far greater than this, Marcus felt a mixture of awe and reassurance, and as the Attorney General put a steady hand on his shoulder, Marcus realized the lesson of the night, that danger could strike anywhere, that enemies could be hidden behind the familiar, and that courage, quick thinking, and an unyielding grasp of one's own power were sometimes the only things standing between chaos and survival. And as the first rays of dawn pierced the smoke-filled horizon, Marcus looked at the remnants of his burned car, the charred streets, the subdued attackers, and the chaos that had engulfed his life for the past hours, and silently vowed that no one would ever underestimate the son of the Attorney General again, that the lessons of fear, strategy, and resilience would become his own weapons, and that, while tonight had been terrifying, it had forged him into someone no one could easily intimidate. And as he and his father walked together through the aftermath, surrounded by flashing lights, cameras, and the quiet murmurs of onlookers, Marcus felt a sense of clarity piercing the exhaustion, a knowledge that while threats would come again, and enemies would lurk in shadows unseen, he was no longer merely reacting. He was prepared, and as he glanced back at the smoky remains of the street where the night's terror had unfolded, a faint, knowing smile touched his lips, because he understood, in that final moment of tension and release, that he had survived not just by chance, but by a combination of courage, intellect, and the unshakable legacy of a father whose power was absolute, and the story of the night, the fire, the threats, the near escape, would forever mark the beginning of Marcus stepping into a life of vigilance, awareness, and unstoppable resolve, a life in which no shadow could ever hide long enough to strike unnoticed again. And as the sun rose higher, casting light on the blackened asphalt and the subdued chaos, Marcus felt the first real sense of triumph, though a whisper of doubt lingered, reminding him that vigilance was eternal. And with one final glance at the quiet, smoke-scented street, he whispered to himself, "This is just the beginning." Presence of law enforcement and private security surrounding the attackers, cutting off escape routes, and turning what had been an almost cinematic trap into a controlled standoff. And as Marcus stepped out of the SUV, adrenaline still coursing through him, eyes scanning every shadow, he saw the lead figure, the one thought lost to history, being restrained, the drones deactivated, the envelopes and maps collected as evidence, and for the first time that night, a sliver of relief pierced the tension, though he knew the war of threats, power, and influence was far from over, and as his father arrived on the scene, exuding the calm authority of someone who had weathered storms far greater than this, Marcus felt a mixture of awe and reassurance, and as the Attorney General put a steady hand on his shoulder, Marcus realized the lesson of the night, that danger could strike anywhere, that enemies could be hidden behind the familiar, and that courage, quick thinking, and an unyielding grasp of one's own power were sometimes the only things standing between chaos and survival. And as the first rays of dawn pierced the smoke-filled horizon, Marcus looked at the remnants of his burned car, the charred streets, the subdued attackers, and the chaos that had engulfed his life for the past hours, and silently vowed that no one would ever underestimate the son of the Attorney General again, that the lessons of fear, strategy, and resilience would become his own weapons, and that, while tonight had been terrifying, it had forged him into someone no one could easily intimidate. And as he and his father walked together through the aftermath, surrounded by flashing lights, cameras, and the quiet murmurs of onlookers, Marcus felt a sense of clarity piercing the exhaustion, a knowledge that while threats would come again, and enemies would lurk in shadows unseen, he was no longer merely reacting. He was prepared, and as he glanced back at the smoky remains of the street where the night's terror had unfolded, a faint, knowing smile touched his lips, because he understood, in that final moment of tension and release, that he had survived not just by chance, but by a combination of courage, intellect, and the unshakable legacy of a father whose power was absolute, and the story of the night, the fire, the threats, the near escape, would forever mark the beginning of Marcus stepping into a life of vigilance, awareness, and unstoppable resolve, a life in which no shadow could ever hide long enough to strike unnoticed again. and as the sun rose higher, casting light on the blackened asphalt and the subdued chaos, Marcus felt the first real sense of triumph, though a whisper of doubt lingered, reminding him that vigilance was eternal, and with one final glance at the quiet, smoke-scented street, he whispered to himself, "This is just the beginning." Just as Marcus thought the nightmare of the previous night had ended, the faint hum of his phone vibrating on the dashboard reminded him that the world outside the immediate chaos of his burned car and the subdued attackers was far from calm, and with trembling hands he answered, only to hear a voice distorted yet unmistakably clear. "You survived yesterday. Good, but survival is only the beginning." And the words immediately sent a shiver down his spine, because they confirmed what he had feared: the fire, the drones, the envelopes, the black SUVs, the shadowed figures. None of it had been an isolated attack. It had been a signal, a declaration, and the first act in a sequence that was far from over, and as he listened, the distorted voice continued, revealing details only someone with intimate knowledge of the Attorney General's inner circle could know, dropping hints about Marcus's routines, his friends, and even the obscure security measures at his father's office, and each revelation felt like a direct knife to his sense of safety, a cruel reminder that the enemy was not only bold but extraordinarily well-informed, a predator waiting for any sign of weakness, and Marcus felt a mix of fury, fear, and cold calculation solidifying within him, because he now knew that running or hiding was no longer sufficient. He had to confront the threat, understand the game, and strike with precision before it struck again, and as he hung up, a faint knock at the door of the safe house startled him, sending adrenaline surging through his veins, and approaching cautiously, he peeked through the reinforced security peephole, only to see a courier in a plain jacket, holding a nondescript package, a small slip of paper taped to the top with only one word scrawled in red ink, "Tonight," and Marcus's pulse quickened, because the vagueness of the message implied something immediate, dangerous, and unavoidable. And as he tore open the package, he discovered an assortment of items: a compact camera, a small tracking device, and a note outlining a rendezvous point in a part of the city that was notorious for abandoned warehouses and shadowed alleys, and he understood instantly that this was no random trap. It was a challenge, a test, and perhaps even a provocation to draw him into a controlled environment where the enemy could manipulate events entirely, and Marcus's mind raced, considering every angle, every possibility, from surveillance cameras to hidden exit routes, while mentally reviewing the lessons of the previous night, the drones, the SUVs, the envelope, the carefully orchestrated chase, and he realized that to survive what was coming, he would have to anticipate not just their next move, but the move after that, the psychological layers beneath every action, and he knew he could rely on no one but himself, because even trusted allies could be compromised, and the stakes were now higher than ever, because the enemy had demonstrated knowledge, cunning, and ruthlessness that left little room for error, and as the night descended again, Marcus prepared himself, double-checking every piece of equipment, memorizing routes, and rehearsing responses to potential ambushes, until the city's shadows seemed to come alive around him, alive with whispers of danger, malice, and an unspoken challenge, and stepping out into the darkness, he noticed subtle movements at the edges of streetlights, fleeting figures who might have been passerby, or might have been scouts, eyes trained on him, reporting back to the orchestrators of the previous night's terror, and every instinct in him screamed that the warehouse, the rendezvous point, would be a crucible designed to push him to the brink, and yet Marcus could feel the lessons of the fire, the envelopes, the chase coursing through him, sharpening his senses, and as he approached the location, he noticed signs of manipulation. Doors ajar where none should be, lights flickering as if controlled remotely, faint scents of smoke and oil lingering, and subtle tracks in the dust indicating movement, and the realization hit him. They were expecting him, predicting him, controlling every aspect of this environment, and he had to turn their control into an opportunity, using their confidence and overreach against them, and as he crept through the main hall of the abandoned warehouse, his eyes adjusting to darkness, the faint glimmer of surveillance monitors lining the walls made his stomach drop, revealing multiple angles of the room, angles he would have to neutralize if he hoped to survive, and then a voice, calm, chillingly familiar, resonant through the cavernous space, spoke from above, amplified by hidden speakers. "Welcome, Marcus. Tonight, we separate the weak from the strong. Do you have what it takes?" And Marcus felt the weight of every past event crash into this moment. The fire, the SUVs, the drones, the envelope, the shadowed figures, and knew that this was a test of not only his courage and intelligence but also his ability to manipulate perception, exploit weakness, and control the narrative in a situation meticulously designed to break him, and then, without warning, figures emerged from the shadows, masked, black-clad, moving with terrifying synchronicity. And Marcus realized that the only way to survive was to fight mentally as much as physically, to anticipate, misdirect, and use every ounce of skill he had, and as the first step toward confrontation, he triggered a small device he had taken from the package, sending a flare of light and noise that temporarily disoriented his attackers, and in the ensuing chaos, he darted behind stacked crates, moving silently, mapping escape routes, and noting every line of sight from cameras, every potential threat vector, every weak point in the enemy's formation, and as he prepared to strike, he heard the lead figure's voice again, dripping with menace. "You've learned much, Marcus, but learning isn't enough. You must adapt, improvise, or perish." And at that instant, Marcus realized that the night was not just a test of strength or survival, but a game of intellect, strategy, and nerve. And as he executed a rapid sequence of maneuvers, turning the warehouse's layout against the attackers, manipulating shadows, cameras, and movement, he began to seize control of the situation, turning their assumptions into traps, and one by one, the figures faltered, until finally, the lead orchestrator, the one thought gone from history, was cornered, exposed, and Marcus, breathing heavily, adrenaline still coursing, stepped forward, confronting the person who had orchestrated so much fear and chaos, eyes locked. And in that harrowing moment, the whispered threat from earlier echoed in his mind. "Tonight, you will see who truly controls the game," and Marcus, voice steady despite exhaustion and tension, answered, "I control my life. And no one threatens it without consequence." And the figure, smirk faltering, realized that Marcus had not only survived every trap, but had outmaneuvered them at every step, and as law enforcement arrived moments later, drawn by the precise signals Marcus had activated, the orchestrator was taken into custody, their network of surveillance and manipulation dismantled piece by piece, and Marcus, standing amidst the wreckage of fear, the remnants of traps, and the defeated figures of those who sought to intimidate him, felt a powerful clarity. That danger could come from any direction, enemies could be cunning beyond imagination, but resilience, intelligence, and the ability to remain calm under pressure could turn even the darkest night into a story of survival and victory. And as the sun began to rise, illuminating the warehouse, the empty streets, and the lingering smoke from minor fires set as distractions, Marcus finally exhaled fully for the first time, understanding that while threats would always exist, he had learned the ultimate lesson, that courage, quick thinking, and the legacy of a father's vigilance could transform fear into empowerment, and he knew, deep in his core, that he was no longer simply a target, but a force to be reckoned with, prepared for any shadow that dared to challenge him in the future.